Hey everybody, welcome to the 8th episode of Thru FM. Today I've got something a little extra special for you all. I'm going to be joined by Rodney Smith of Watch It Played, and him and I are going to kind of dual tandem interview James Hewitt, who was the lead rules writer on the new version of Necromunda that is releasing in the next couple of weeks by the time that you hear this. It'll probably be up for pre-order at the time that you hear this, so if not, in the next day or two. And if you're not familiar with Necromunda, it was a game that originally came out from Games Workshop back in 1995, and it had a couple of different iterations around about then. And now it's been kind of somewhat dormant, although the community at large has been keeping that game very active. But it's been officially dormant for quite some time, and now it's being brought back. And it has some significant changes and some significant similarities to the original game. So we're going to go ahead and jump into the interview here in just a second. After the interview, I'll go ahead and do a couple of reviews and also just kind of do a little bit of normal podcasty type thing. So this episode will be slightly longer than normal. The interview runs about an hour, and then so we'll do the extra stuff after that to kind of wrap everything up. And just wanted to mention here, you haven't probably seen a video review from me in a little over a week or so. Just everything's been kind of crazy with Halloween, and there was just a lot of things going on that weekend and everything around there. So I've been sort of dormant in terms of the drive-through stuff. And then trying to also schedule this interview was very difficult because I am in Pacific time zone. Rodney is in Atlantic time zone, way over on the far eastern side of Canada. And of course, James is in the UK. So trying to arrange all those different time zones was a little bit of a feat. But let's just go ahead and jump right into the interview now. And then you can stay after if you like and listen to a couple of reviews. Okay, so I am now joined by a couple of fine gentlemen. One is, I would call, a Necromunda superfan, and the other one might be a superfan. He's definitely a super designer. First, let's jump in and introduce Rodney Smith of Watch It Played. Hello, Rodney.
Hello, Joel. Yes, I am a super fan of Necromunda. It was my first foray into miniatures games back in 1995. That was my first miniatures game. I remember seeing it in the comic book store. It had this crazy, gory cover, all these giant dudes shooting guns at each other. There's no way any of them could have been alive because they would have all been struck by bullets within the first second. But it was just this crazy psychedelic box of violence, and I was just like, what is in this box? I need to find out. And it was my first foray into miniatures games, was Necromunda.
Awesome. And just for the record, I never played Necromunda. I heard mostly about it from Rodney. I have played a newer edition sort of thing that came out maybe not quite a year ago called Shadow War Armageddon, which uses the same rule set but set more in the Warhammer 40k universe proper, and I've enjoyed that. And Rodney Smith, if you have been living under a rock, of course, does the Watch It Played channel with lots of board game playthroughs and instructional videos and all kinds of other great content.
And the occasional miniatures game.
Yes, occasional miniatures game as well. You did a great playthrough and rules instructions for Shadespire. Is that right?
Yeah, Shadespire and Guild Ball was another sort of recent miniatures game as well that I featured. But yeah, Shadespire was a really fun one to do recently because it kind of did that nice thing of bridging the gap, I think, between like a full-on miniatures game and the board game spectrum of gaming.
And our guest of the hour, our featured guest, is James Hewitt. I hope I pronounced that correctly, James. I didn't ask you before we started.
No, you absolutely did. I'm not quite sure how else you could pronounce it, but I think however you want to is fine by me.
And James is, would you call yourself a co-designer of the new Necromunda?
Yeah, so I was lead rules designer. So I was part of the specialist games team at Games Workshop until July of this year. It's quite a small team. There were, at the time, 3 of us, give or take. The occasional sculptor, and so that was my boss Andy, who is he was the manager of the team, still is. I was in charge of rules, design, and that whole kind of thing. Then we had a couple of sculptors as well. So really the rules side of the game was me. And I'm also a Necromunda superfan because you have to be to do that kind of thing.
Yes. So let's take a quick detour from Necromunda and get more into James. Speaking of superfan, I have a list of kind of questions here Rodney and I are going to give you back and forth. But I'm a little
Cool.
bit curious about kind of your gamer origin story. So, like, what was the first game that made you kind of fall in love, make you want to design games, that kind of thing? And
Yeah.
how did you kind of come up into all of this?
So, board games have kind of been quite a big thing in my family, I think, for a long time. I remember my aunt and uncle had a massive board game cupboard, all kind of party games, kind of stuff, charades, Trivial Pursuit, the kind of more normal side of the spectrum, so to speak. But really, for myself, it was when I got given a copy of Hero Quest for my birthday back in 87, 88, that would have been. And my dad got that for me, and as I'm an only child and none of my friends were interested, he immediately regretted that because I kept going to him to play it with me. And to this day I've never gotten to play a game. I will eventually one day do it.
So he never caved.
But
He
yes,
never
I did-
caved to you.
No. There are actually, I've still got the copy, and there are one or two of the character sheets that are filled in. I dug it out recently because my mum moved house, so I was unpacking things, and there are some character sheets that are kind of testament to games where I tried to get him to take part, and he's like written bad jokes for the names of the characters, and then we gave up 5-10 minutes in. It's a tragic tale.
A common
but,
tale, I think, for a lot of gamers.
But
yeah.
despite that, oh, absolutely, yeah. But despite that, it really kind of, really set me going on the dark path that's led to where I am today. So I got into Games Workshop games through Hero Quest and Space Crusade, and through a couple of friends at school who were passing around a copy of White Dwarf magazine. This would have been around issue 175, I think, was when I got into it. And yeah, I was a big Games Workshop gamer for a long time. Got into some tabletop role-playing games, and through that, playing a game at a gaming club, a local gaming store, in fact, I spotted, this would have been about 10 years ago, a board game on one of the shelves called Last Night on Earth, which is kind of a zombie B-movie style board game. And as a fan of schlock horror movies, I was like, what this looks cool, what is this? And that began my descent into board gaming, which I've not looked back from. So these days, I love games of all sorts, really.
I saw you posted on Twitter there about Pandemic Legacy Season 2. It seems like you're a fan of that series.
Yes. Yeah, we've just hit... I think we're just into March now, so no spoilers, but it's really cool. We did, myself and my partner Sophie, we did Pandemic Legacy Season 1 in the month leading up to our daughter being born. So we were both kind of pretty stressed out, generally. And we thought, you know what we need to do? Let's just play a really cool game. And did the entire thing in about 2 weeks.
Nice.
Which was really cool. We really enjoyed it. But yeah, so that's my... in a nutshell, gaming life, I suppose, and now I do it for a living.
So would you say you're more of a board gamer, or are you more of like do you get into the miniature side of 40K and the Warhammer Fantasy or Age of Sigmar?
Yeah, it all depends on what I'm up to at the time, really. So at the moment, because as I say, we've got a 2-year-old now, don't get a lot of time for painting or playing kind of big, elaborate campaigns. For me, miniatures games, I really enjoy like campaign gaming, linking things together, doing like a big narrative, that whole kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Haven't got time for that so much these days, so I'm much happier kind of cracking out a board game. I'm saying this in the middle of a pandemic legacy campaign, of course.
I was just thinking that same thing, but at least that one you can sort of break it into small chunks, and
precisely.
And you're playing at home too, I assume, right? With
absolutely, and we haven't got the room for a gaming table right now.
Right.
But yeah, so I'm definitely much more into board games. Have been the last couple of years, and they're just addictive. What I love with board games generally is that every box on your shelf is just a lovely idea. That you can unwrap and get into, and everyone's unique in some way, and I love that.
Mm-hmm. I love that way of looking at it. That's every box is like some new world to sort of get into, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
I kind of have a question for you thinking about that, because obviously you've expressed an enjoyment of gaming and hobbies in the hobby for a long time, but I'm wondering how did you end up at Games Workshop? Like, were there other games that you've designed for Games Workshop before you were given the ultimate gift? Like, what made you worthy? What made you worthy to work on Necromunda? Why were you handed this mantle? I want to know.
Whether I'm worthy, of course, will be determined by the fans when the game comes out. So,
Right.
But yeah.
So how'd you come to Games Workshop? Like, what started that?
Well, so I actually started in the retail side of the company back in 2002. I dropped out of a linguistics degree because I realised I was doing a degree in linguistics, and I love it as a subject, but it's not a thing I could stick with to study. But yeah, I dropped out, needed a job, and a friend of mine had just left a part-time Saturday job at the local Games Workshop, so I went in there and got hired. Back in those days, it was very different. The interview was literally held in the pub across the road. And involved a quiz on, I think, the Warhammer rulebook or something. It was looking back, it was kind of bizarre. But I ended up working in retail for Games Workshop for about 10 years. Ran a couple of stores around the London area. Eventually decided to kind of get out into the real world, so to speak. Hated it. And ran back towards the gaming industry. So I worked for Mantic Games on Dreadball, which was kind of my first taste of a design project. So I was kind of co-designer on that. And
It's a great game. I love that game, by the way.
It's good fun. So Dreadball, Blood Bowl, look out Guild Ball. I'm on the way. But yeah, I worked there for about a year as a community manager. So I did a lot of stuff with YouTube videos, Facebook events, all that kind of stuff. But then a position came up at Games Workshop on the rules team, and so I thought, you know what, I want to design rules. I'd wanted to kind of get into game design for the longest time. I'd been doing it. I'd been kind of inventing my own games. I think I designed a role-playing game before I played a role-playing game, which in hindsight, it was dreadful because I hadn't played any role-playing games, but still, game design has always been a thing I've been really keen on, and so when the position came up, I went for it. And it was actually, I think that was my fourth time applying for that job. I'd applied a few times previously. At one point I got down to the final two, and it was very, very close, but ended up not quite getting it that time. But this time, as I say, because I had a bit more experience in the industry, I'd done a bit more stuff in my own life as well, I was taken on board, and yeah, I got to work on all sorts of things. So when I first turned up, Age of Sigmar was just in development. So I was able to kind of contribute to some of the design on that, which was really cool. Worked a load of
Which part of the 4 pages did you do? Which paragraph was yours?
Yeah. The 4 pages thing, as I understand it, it was initially it was meant to be an ethos, like make the rules simple enough they could fit on 4 pages, and somewhere along the line that got crystallized into something very literal. So we ended up with 4 pages of rules. I did a load of work on the compendiums that came out alongside the main release.
Right.
I wrote the first Stormcast Eternals battle tome, the Khorne Bloodbound, Seraphon Fireslayers, and Everchosen bits of. And that was all in a rules capacity. So I was in the rules team, and there'd always be one person doing the rules, one person doing the narrative in the background, and you'd kind of collaborate together.
So you were responsible for like the war scrolls and the battalions and that stuff?
Yeah, that was it. Yeah, okay. And it's interesting though because you're one cog in quite a large machine. So the miniatures are all made first, and then they come through to the publications department. Who there's a manager, like a product manager, whose job it is to go, right, we're going to make this battle tome, and we're going to put here are the units. Here's what they're called. Here's the kind of thing we want them to do. And then the rules and background go away and make those things happen. And it's all very collaborative. I mean, there was a team of 4 of us doing rules, and it was lots of bouncing ideas around and giving each other lots of constant review, which I won't lie was an amazing atmosphere to work in. You can imagine the opportunity to design rules for a living in a 9-to-5 office environment where you're getting constant support and encouragement is just unheard of. It's not a thing you can do in many places.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, but so that's kind of how I got there. You also said what games I've worked on. So I say Age of Sigmar. I did a fair few things for Warhammer 40,000. Didn't have anything to do with the most recent edition. That was after I'd moved on. But I did a few codexes and things before that. And then also did 3 standalone games. So I did the Horus Heresy Betrayal at Calth, which was like a hex-based tactical skirmish game.
Right.
Gore Chosen, which
Yep.
another hex-based. Hang on a second, what is it with hexes?
There's something here.
Yeah.
Did you try to get hexes into Age of Sigmar?
So yeah, Age of Hexmar.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And Warhammer Quest Silver Tower, which it almost drove me mad. It was a labour of love, and I wouldn't change it for the world.
Yeah, that's probably my favorite of the three. Well, I haven't actually played Betrayal at Calth yet. That's one it's on my very long to-do list. But
yeah, I think about 12 people have played it. Everyone else bought it for the miniatures, found some cardboard bits, and threw them out a window.
Well, I think it's really interesting you mentioned that, because I think some of the box games that we saw from Games Workshop, I wouldn't fault anyone for looking at them sometimes and going, oh, this is a miniatures delivery system, and there's some rules that were thrown in here if you happen to want to play a game. But the main thing is look at the great price on all these great miniatures. But I really feel like there's been a shift in Games Workshop games lately where the game is equal to, if not as good as, or better than the miniatures themselves. There's something actually there to play. Like when you talked about the Silver Tower, like that's a game that really had a lot going on, some interesting innovation and all the rest of it.
So for a while there was kind of the brief that the rules team were given would be like, here is a bunch of miniatures, we're putting them out in a game, and what we were often told was make it so that there's a game, don't break your back on it, make it so there's enough game here for people to play it a few times, but really this is a miniatures box. I struggle with doing something like that. If I'm going to do a thing, I want to really throw myself into it, which is why Betrayal at Cal, Silver Tower, Gore Chosen, they all kind of ended up being a little bit more elaborate than what was intended. And I think if you stack them up against some of the other games that were done at the same time, they were a little bit more involved. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. But since pretty much just after I left, there was a kind of a change in some of the management structure, and there was a push back towards doing more games for the sake of games. Right. And I think Shadespire is kind of the culmination of that. I think that's a great product, because it's targeting a niche that I think Games Workshop hasn't looked at in certainly a very long time, which is the kind of the competitive pick up and play game. It's kind of an X-Wing contender, that kind of thing,
Right.
Designed for organised play, independent stockists, all that kind of thing, which is brilliant. When I was in that team, that was a thing that would never have even been considered. So I'm really happy that that's out now.
Well, I'll say, given your answer to that question, I'm a little more confident in them having handed the reins over to you for Necromunda. We'll see as this goes on, but so far I'm feeling pretty good.
Excellent, that's good.
Well, speaking of Necromunda, so I was a little curious. You said you're a super fan, so you might have already answered this question. But so you played it when it came out, or what's your kind of experience with it?
So White Dwarf, I think it was September 1995. It was the month before Necromunda came out, and like in the first couple of pages there was like a photo of a bunch of the guys in the studio playing this new game called Necromunda, and it talked about gang war in the 41st millennium, and I was like, this sounds freaking awesome. And I remember I got very excited with my bunch of gaming buddies, and we talked about it, how cool it was going to be. We were, assuming all sorts of things, making all sorts of guesses. When it came out, had to get it, and I've played it on and off ever since. So I had an Orlok gang when it first came out, who were they were like the default, really. They were your standard. They were in the box set. They were one of the first metal kits to come out. But I had that. I was the guy that always ran the campaigns for my group, which is it's endured to this day. I'm always the one that ends up reading the rulebook for whatever game we play. And so I was there with Necromunda for that whole time. When Underhive came out in like early 2000s, which was the Fnatic Games release, which was like an updated version of it, I was there for that. I was working in retail, ran several campaigns through the stores I was working in. As well as a few with some buddies at the time. Had a scavvy gang that I'd converted up out of various other gangers, because I quite liked the idea that they were just a bunch of degenerate mutants, rather than the particularly weird-looking alien types mutant scavvies that you had the actual miniatures for. But yeah, as I say, I've dabbled with Necromunda for years. I actually when I had a brief break in my employment with Games Workshop, I was working in a local government benefits office, which was really exciting. And
Sounds like it.
it was. And I was answering phone calls with people who had various issues. And if I had a quiet day, I was working on like my magnum opus, which was I was going to rewrite Necromunda. And funnily enough, a lot of what was in that ended up kind of going into what I've just finished working on recently. So,
Isn't that crazy? Yeah, that's wild.
It just goes to show, never throw anything away. You never know when it will come in handy.
So you were basically brought in to work on this design. Now, were you given any particular parameters about like how new Necromunda should be shaped? Like, I was almost kind of curious too, like, where did the design start? Did you just go back to the original Necromunda? Did you go back to kind of the revised? Were you looking at the living rule book for this, or where did you begin?
So this came in after I'd left the main Games Workshop rules team. I joined what was the new specialist games team. And the whole point of that was it was a very small, agile team, and we were going to bring back old games from, the 80s, 90s, that whole kind of time. And Necromunda was the third thing I'd worked on there. I'll tell you more about the others later if you like. But by the time we got to Necromunda, we kind of had an idea, especially based off Blood Bowl. We had an idea of what worked and what didn't. And so when it came
Do you
to
mean,
this...
sorry to interrupt, but do you mean
Yeah.
the most recent release of Blood Bowl, or just...
Yes,
generally?
indeed, yeah. So that was... So
Okay.
I oversaw the rules design on that as well, although most of it was just a re-release of existing rules.
Right.
But our team was responsible for that game. And so with Necromunda, there were a lot of guidelines and kind of parameters for what the design would be before it got to me.
Okay.
So we had so my boss Andy Hoare, who's still the manager of the team there. He again is a massive Necromunda fan. I think he's played it roughly once a week for the last 20 years. And I'm not even exaggerating. He's been playing a Necromunda campaign for longer than I care to imagine.
Well, I have to say, if you're a Necromunda fan, that's very encouraging to hear, right? To know that the design team is actually quite invested, knows the game well, and has some experience with it.
Yeah. When we came together as a team, it was one of the things that initially we were like, we're going to do Necromunda and we're going to do an awesome job of it, because we knew that we were all fans of it, and so we had to do it justice. So Andy kind of had his thoughts on what the game wanted to be. He was really keen to bring back some of the kind of the retro old school stuff. He's big on his kind of retro gaming. He wanted to bring in some of the stuff from Rogue Trader and the early editions of Warhammer 40,000. He also wanted to switch up the activation system a little bit. He had kind of some ideas for like a card system, which sort of ended up making it in. And as I say, similarly, the kind of people above him had ideas about how this should be a product, which is how it ended up being like your self-contained boxed game with an expansion for the campaigns, the 3D rules, all that kind of thing. So there was a lot kind of going into it. For my point of view, I was really keen to kind of modernise the game a bit, because I was very conscious that much as Necromunda is really good fun and I love it, it's showing its age. It's very much got a lot of 80s design ethos in there. I mean, it was a game that came out in the mid-90s, but the main rule set was really based on Warhammer 40,000 second edition, which had been around for several years before that, and even that was based quite heavily on Rogue Trader, which had been, I think, another 5 years before then. So all I wanted to do with this was modernise it and make it a game that I wanted to play as much as I wanted to play the first one when it first came out.
Yeah, I'm encouraged to hear that as well, because I mean, not a criticism on Blood Bowl or whatever, but it has a lot of the carryovers from the original Blood Bowl, and I think in 20 years game design evolves, right? And so
absolutely,
if you can tap into some of those improvements or efficiencies or whatever, that seems like a good strategy to take. As much as I wanted Necromunda back, I didn't really just want old Necromunda back. I could just play that anytime. I was kind of looking for something that took me back to that place, but maybe rules wise was more streamlined or was different, improved, and modernized, as you say.
That was absolutely the way I was going. Blood Bowl was a really weird one because it has such a large tournament scene. There are, tens of thousands of people who are playing it on a regular basis. There are ranked leagues going on, and they had refined the rules to the point where any small change was really significant to
Right.
a large established fan base. And so we were kind of in this weird place where we didn't want to just release a set of rules that was already out there, but we also didn't want to change anything. So we ended up just re-releasing it as it was, and then adding bits onto it once that was out there. And so that was. But yeah, with Necromunda, that wasn't such an issue. We were happier to just go, this is a new edition of the game. If you'd wanted the old rules, they're out there. Because it was a living rulebook for a while, there are PDFs freely available. You've got the Necromunda Community Edition, which the fans picked up and have been kind of refining and tweaking for a long time. So if you want that particular old school experience, that's absolutely still there. I'm sure a lot of people will be buying the new miniatures just to play the old game.
So one thing to kind of follow up with that is, before we get into any rules things, it's a boxed game, so it's more like a board game out of the gate.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned, I think I read this in the latest White Dwarf, where there was some sort of cost consideration for the initial buy-in. So you can get the initial box for $120 US. I don't know what that converts to everywhere, but that's much more approachable than filling a 4x4 table with a bunch of terrain and all that stuff. But you still have a 3D supplement called Gang War, I believe, right?
That's it.
So
yes, indeed.
What's kind of the thought process there between supporting two different rule sets, and how's that actually going to work? Is it going to be the same game on the board as it is on the miniature tabletop and all that stuff?
I mean, there were a lot of things going into it. So, I mean, the decision to split it that way, that was kind of done above my station, but I was involved in a lot of the conversations around it. And the big thing that was going to be difficult was the days of Games Workshop doing a big box of cardboard scenery are kind of gone. There's a couple of, I think the starter sets for 40k and Age of Sigmar now have, you can use the box tray as a building. But you certainly couldn't do a load of cardboard walkways and that, because it's just the quality of the stuff's moved on now. It would have felt really odd to do that.
James, maybe I should just mention here quickly, just because some people might not be familiar with the original Necromunda, but it came with a box of miniatures, and what was kind of unique about it was it came with a bunch of 3D terrain, leveled terrain. But it was awesome. Yeah. But it was like you said, it was some plastic braces to hold things up, and then cardboard pieces. So I think when this new edition was released, people were maybe wondering, expecting what kind of 3D terrain is going to be packed into the box, and then it wasn't there. And that's, I guess, what Joel's getting at here. So there had to be a decision about that, right?
Well, I will say, when we play Shadow War, my buddies they're big Necromunda fans, and they still have their old Necromunda cardboard and plastic bits, and we mix it all together just to, add a bunch of line of sight blocking. But but that stuff, surprisingly held up pretty well. But anyway, I'm kind of tangenting there. But
So I mean, the whole thing really started with the scenery, the Sector Mechanicus scenery that was coming out. We were like, well, that's coming out, so we can do Necromunda. That was because in our mind, you can't do Necromunda without a big, cool 3D table. That was our first thought. At the same time, the main studio had the same idea, which is where Shadow War came from. Which was kind of strange because it meant they were using the Necromunda rules with kind of the serial number filed off. And we then were developing a brand new Necromunda at the same time. It was all a little bit of a weird situation there.
Well, was there? Did you guys each know that the other was doing?
They definitely knew that we were doing Necromunda. We started Necromunda before Shadow War began development.
Okay.
And I don't know how how conscious a decision it was to make it quite as Necromunda-y as it was. But whatever the case, it was two different teams working on a similar thing at a similar time, which I think really then blindsided all the fans, because when Shadow War came out, it was like, well, that's Necromunda pretty much. So
right.
Probably there won't be a Necromunda for some time. And then we came out and said, oh, by the way, Necromunda. but yeah, as I say... So
I went from years having no Necromunda to suddenly having, more than I could ask for.
It's like waiting for a bus, isn't it? Yeah. But yeah, so long story short, it was kind of decided that if we were to put a small amount of this plastic terrain into the box, it would inflate the price so much, but you still wouldn't have anywhere near enough to play a decent game. Because the thing with Necromunda, when you're playing on a 3D board, you want that kind of tangle of walkways. You want it to be really dense. And so, at some point in the process, the idea came up, hang on, why don't we do two different things and have... Because you've already got kind of the idea in the narrative in the background of, tangles of tunnel networks and whatever else running through the hive. Why not just do that? I mean, Forge World produced a set of scenery tiles called Zone Mortalis, which is a set of like tangly industrial corridors, which are designed for playing games of 40k on. And we thought, well, hang on, we can repurpose the idea of that for Necromunda. And so what we ended up with was two different ways of playing. So you play effectively your tunnel fights, Zone Mortalis games as they're called, or you play your Sector Mechanicus games, which are your 3D ones. The game is absolutely the same either way. The only difference from a rules point of view is we put in an abstraction for line of sight on the board game version, just because you can't do... So the main game is true line of sight, but that's difficult when there aren't any walls where there should be.
Right. So
the board game version, if you want to call it that, has got a very simplified kind of line of sight mechanic. But beyond that, for example, in a campaign, you might play 3 games in a row, 2 of which are in tunnels, 1 of which is up on the walkways.
Okay.
What's really interesting, what I really like, is they play very differently. So the Zone Mortalis games, which are much more claustrophobic. For a start, you can play it on a much smaller area. You can play on even 2 feet square is a really interesting game. And there are lots of doors, the big plastic bulkhead doors that are in there. They make for some really tense moments. You kind of get gangs lining up either side of a doorway, waiting for someone to open it, and all that kind of flinging grenades around corners, sneaking through air ducts. We wanted to make that game as interesting as the 3D version. So that was kind of, as I say, that was the decision for doing the box game as it was, but then we wanted to do the 3D rules as well, because of course you can't do Necromunda and not put in rules for playing across gantries and walkways. That'd be crazy. But the thing that had worked quite well with Blood Bowl, because Games Workshop at the moment is expanding into a lot of emerging markets. So there are stores opening in like Singapore. There's a decent presence now in Japan. Areas where tabletop gaming is not as big as it is in the Western world, if you like. What Blood Bowl was good with was, because it was a self-contained box, you could sell that somewhere where there isn't a presence of other things, and people can play that without having to expand it at all. And so there was a drive to make sure that the Necromunda box game doesn't feel like half a product. So if you pick that up for the first time as a brand new customer, you've never seen it before, you go into the shop, pick it off the shelf and play it. It's not saying, oh, by the way, you have to add some scenery or you need to add this other stuff. And so the brief became, the box just contains rules for what's in the box.
Right.
I have to say,
one thing I noticed that was interesting. Oh, go ahead, Rodney.
Okay, well, one thing I just want to mention, although we're talking about there being a lack of, full 3D terrain, I have to say I was fortunate. I was able to bring home a copy of Necromunda with me from Essenspiel. So I've spent this past weekend, assembling all the miniatures and all the terrain, because there's a lot of actual plastic terrain pieces here. There's a ton of doors. There's a bunch of things to hide behind, busted stuff. There's cool crates that you open up, and inside you can see weapons and stuff stashed in there. There's all kinds of little terminals you can play with. All this full plastic 3D. The miniatures, there's 10 miniatures for each gang that's included in the box, and when you play a scenario, you might only be playing with 6 of them. So you have choices. You can make choices about which gangs you're going to play with. So I think what you're saying about being very self-contained, and I should also mention, I just today read through all the rules, and when I got to the end of that, I did not feel like I just finished reading half of a rule set. If anything, it was wow, there's a lot happening in this game still. It hasn't been... let's say, dumbed down, if you will. No,
absolutely. I mean, there was a huge drive to make sure that it not only is a self-contained product, but there's plenty in there. So even if you're just playing with the 2 starter gangs, the Iron Lords and the Carrion Queens, I think they're called, even if you're just playing with that, just playing the 6 scenarios that are in there, you can play through that enough times and everyone will be different. We really wanted to make it feel like if you just pick up this box and nothing else, you're still going to have a really good time with it. And I think, hopefully, fingers crossed, I think we've achieved that. We'll see though.
Yeah, I haven't actually played yet, so I have to wait. But I definitely
Yeah.
felt again like just through reading it all, and you kind of split the rules into two things. There's kind of like a basic, like, hey, here's enough to get you started, and then when you're ready and you're
Yeah.
comfortable with that, here's the full advanced rules, which packs in a whole bunch of other stuff.
Yeah, there's lots in there because I think it starts off, and that was a big. There was a lot of judgment calls there. You know, which bits are basic, which parts are integral to the game experience, and which parts kind of add extra flavor. And so things like the ammo roll, I think, only comes in the advanced section. You know,
That's
where
right,
can
yeah.
run out of bullets. A lot of the advanced combat rules. We wanted to make sure that the basic game, you know, you'd play through that for your first one or two games, and then introduce the more advanced stuff. But yeah, this was definitely not a dumbing down, which I'm quite happy with because
But-
I didn't want to dumb this game down.
Right, and obviously there are some differences between the new edition and the original. What would you say? How would you summarize maybe some of the biggest changes? Is that something you kind of have on the tip of your tongue there?
Yeah, I would say probably the biggest difference is probably the player has more agency, I think, in what's going on. By which I mean you've got more decisions to make. You've got more options available to you. I mean, in my mind, good game design is all about giving the player decisions.
Agreed. Yeah.
Wherever possible. And so original Necromunda, you know, on your turn, you move all your guys, you shoot with all your guys. You're making a few choices about where they're going to move and what they're going to shoot at, but they're still very much doing a very limited variety of things. Whereas in this, there's a whole activation system. So you're activating one model at a time, going back and forth between the two players. You might activate one of your leaders or champions who can bring a couple others with them as they activate. And then when they do activate, they're doing various different things. So they might be, you know, making an aimed shot, or you know, charging into a combat, ducking for cover. There are various things that aren't just moving and shooting. We wanted to kind of really incorporate. So that's to me the main difference is the player can do more stuff.
Yeah,
But
and
we're
alternating
really-
activations is, I mean,
Yeah.
that's a huge, not to be facetious, but that's like a huge step for Games Workshop.
It is.
you
It's
know,
dragging
it's-
it, kicking
'cause-
and screaming
yeah.
into the mid-noughties, you know.
But the one thing I noticed, there were two things that I noticed just from the White Dwarf that came out. I've
Yeah.
been pouring through it, obviously. The alternating activations is huge, but you've also introduced card play, which I
Yeah.
was pretty interested in because I personally am a huge fan of anything card driven where you've got sort of a hidden agenda. You know, what might they have? What do I got? When's the best time to play this? How does the card play actually work?
So you've got two types of cards in the game. The first one is you've got fighter cards. So every ganger you've got in your force has a card which has their stats on it. And there's a bunch of those pre-filled out and a bunch of ones that you can fill out separately. I pushed really hard. I was really pushing with the people who kind of make, you know, decisions on what goes in the box to make sure that the cards were a nice matte finish if you're drawing on them, so you can draw on them with pencil and erase it quite easily. Because
nice.
I've tried erasing glossy cards and it just doesn't work. But yeah, so you've got that, and that idea straight away does a few things. First of all, it means that if you have to, say, pick 3 random fighters to be your sentries, you can just shuffle your deck and deal them out. That's nice and easy. During the game, we had a big drive to not clutter up the gaming area with tokens and things. So when you want to put a token saying this guy's taken a flesh wound or he's out of ammo, that goes on their fighter card rather than on the board, so the board stays looking nice and is uncluttered. So that's kind of the first type of card you've got. Secondly, you've got tactics cards, which are basically a complete borrow from Blood Bowl. So in Blood Bowl, you have special play cards, which they're kind of an optional extra, but we've integrated them a bit more here. You have a deck of, I think it's 10 standard tactics cards, and there are 2 duplicate sets in the box. So each player has a deck of 10. Plus you have ones that are specific to your faction. So in the box you've got 4 additional Escher cards and 4 Goliath cards, 1 for each of the 2 gangs, that is. And I think there are some expansion packs coming out with more of those. But the idea is at the start of the game, depending on which scenario you're playing, you can pick a couple of these cards. Sometimes, if, for example, it's a surprise attack, the defender might get a couple at random rather than choosing. And then they're kind of things they're like one-use cards you play, and they'll do a thing. So things like picking up an improvised weapon, or you've actually got a pistol hidden in your belt that the opponent didn't know about, or as one of my favourite ones is, I think, Last Gasp, which is when you die, you get to make one more attack. And if it's a grenade, if you've got a grenade, you can center it on yourself and it doesn't scatter. You can blow yourself up as you go, which, let's face it, that's just cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're just kind of little cunning tricks, which, as you say, the whole point is it's meaning that your opponent has imperfect information. They can't guess exactly what you're going to do in your turn, and they might only come up once or twice in the game because they're limited use cards. And we don't want to make it a complete random take that fest. But they just add a bit of flavour. Also, the fact that we've got the ones that are tailored to the different gangs, they let you really play up the flavour and the theme of them. So the Goliath deck's all about being a big steroided meathead who doesn't die easily. The Escher one's about being kind of sneaky and using chemical weapons, all that kind of thing.
Yeah, I noticed one of the Escher ones lets you, like, after setup, you can reveal it, and it's like, okay, now I get to move all of my figures a couple inches forward.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to change the setup of this game because we snuck in. That's cool.
It.
Yeah, and so you mentioned you most of the time you get choice, so you can take a look at the scenario and the layout and go, oh, well, for this time I might use these three instead of these others and stuff like that.
That's it. And a lot of the time in the scenarios, you'll be picking your kind of your crew in secret. So your gang is kind of all your fighters. So if you're playing with the default ones from the box, that's your 10 fighters who make up your gang. But in a scenario, you'll generally pick a crew of a number of them, depending on which one it is you're playing. And you'll tend to play, so you'll pick those and your tactics cards all face down. So you don't know what the other person's bringing until the game starts, really.
Right.
So you're kind of looking at them thinking, right, in the scenario, I know what their mission is going to be. Are they likely to bring their big, combat guys or whatever? And you can pick your tactics cards accordingly. Cool. When you get to Gang War and you've got kind of the campaign mode, you get lots of situations where you might be ambushing the other gang, and you'll be picking all your really sneaky, dirty tricks from the deck as well. So it all kind of works together to really add a bit of narrative and theme to the game.
That sounds great. I can't wait.
Excellent.
So speaking of, let's see, Escher and Goliath,
yeah,
I noticed that they're very, I would say, in many ways, very different factions. Aesthetically, it seems like mechanically to a degree, and maybe strategically, all that good stuff. Is that kind of why you guys chose that? Because they were just two very different teams?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, part of it was we wanted the theme to be the guys with big hair, but
it's true. They all have very big hair.
Absolutely. They both sets of miniatures have separate hair pieces. I'm guessing, Rodney, you will have noticed this when you build them. You have the face and the hair are separate, which is cool. So I think so Andy, my boss at the time, it was his call to kind of decide which gangs went in there, and he was really keen to get two very different gangs. And in the box game that came out back in the 90s, it was Orlox and Goliath, who are both kind of straightforward, tough guy kind of things, whereas here we, let's switch it up. So you kind of got Escher, who are much quicker, they're sneaky, they've got that whole kind of thing going on, against the Goliaths, who are very straightforward. It's just kind of a really nice contrast.
Right. And so Goliath seems to me, having not played, to be more melee oriented versus
yeah, definitely range. They're kind of melee, short range, high rate of fire kind of stuff.
Gotcha.
Subtlety doesn't really happen with the Goliaths, Also, I mean, one difference from the previous edition of the game is that it used to be that your starting gang was pretty much identical, whichever house you chose. So an Escher and a Goliath gang, they had the same stat profile. I think you had a few different weapon options when you were a starting gang, depending on which one you were. But overall, a ganger was a ganger. Mm-hmm. Whereas we've taken the opportunity to go, actually, it feels wrong that this hulking great, nearly 7-foot dude has the same profile as the Escher. Maybe let's change it up. So they've now got their own bespoke profile, which I just think it makes it more interesting. It means that when you come to pick your your gang, you can kind of even go just by the visual, you'll get an idea of what they can do in the game. Look at Goliaths, they look big and tough, and funnily enough, yeah, they're big and tough.
Mm-hmm. You didn't know, you mentioned they have stat cards for each of them, but in a campaign, how is the progression going to work? Because I'm just putting this out there. So do you choose one of those characters and one of those stat cards, or is it a different sort of process when you sort of initially create your gang?
So what happens is, so you've got two things. So first of all, in the box game, you've got your blank cards. So in the box game, there's like a simplified set of rules for creating a gang for one-off games. So you can just create a rough and ready, here's a Goliath Russia gang. In Gang War, we introduce a full set of campaign rules for creating a gang. So what you'll have is you'll still have your blank cards. You'll fill them in as you go. So you won't use the pre-generated ones. You'll create them from scratch.
Okay.
And you'll also use a gang roster sheet, like the ones that Necromunda used to have, where you're recording various things like the size of your turf, any special territories you've picked up, any skills or any advancements gained by your fighters. Mm-hmm. But you're still using that deck of fighter cards. What we have done, and I'm quite happy with this, in my experience, games like Necromunda, Blood Bowl's a real big culprit for this. When you start leveling up your guys, you have to really remember who's got what special skill, and it can be quite a drag.
Yeah.
The big benefit of having your fighter cards is that everyone's got their stats right there.
I love
you
that.
can see exactly what it is. But also, we've done a dividing line. I don't think this has actually been discussed on anywhere yet, so this could be an exclusive piece of information.
Yes.
We've divided the gang, so to speak, into, you've got your main characters, so your leader, your champions, your Juves, who, if this were a TV series, if this was Sons of Anarchy or one of those kind of TV series about your gang, these are the guys who are kind of front and center, the main cast. The gangers, who traditionally have kind of been the bulk of the gang. They're still the bulk of the gang, but they're kind of background characters. They're all still individually named. They all still have the ability to progress. But when a ganger gets an advancement, they do it differently to your other characters. So in the game, you'll get experience points. You'll mark those down on your roster sheet. When you get to, I think, 6 experience points for a ganger, you roll 2d6 on a table, and one of their stats will increase. So they're not getting a new skill or anything that you have to refer to elsewhere. It's just a straightforward stat increase that is just visible on their card. So you can see it straight away. Your more prominent fighters, you spend their XP however you like. So various advancements have different costs. And you go, right, I'm going to give this guy a weapon skill upgrade. It costs this much because he's my combat guy. Mm-hmm. And they can also they can get skills, which are kind of, it'll have a little keyword on the card, and you look that up in the book. It means the number of skills in your gang is much reduced compared to old Necromunda, so you're not having to remember quite as many obscure rules, which I think's a win. But it also means it focuses the narrative on those more prominent characters. But gangers, when they make that 2d6 roll to see what advancement they get, one of the things they can get on a double 1 or double 6 is they become a specialist, which lets them level up from that point onwards as though they were a champion or leader.
Oh, cool.
So
they move into the foreground of your gang a little bit more.
Yeah, that kind of thing of a background character stepping up. And for me, that was one of the big joys of Necromunda, seeing your kind of nobody, rock bottom Juve or ganger eventually become the leader of your gang, and that can still happen here.
Awesome.
I remember with
the other. Go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, I remember like with the old Necromunda, if you upgraded your character, they might get a new weapon or they might get something else, and then you were kind of obligated to like snap the plastic gun off your miniature and glue on something else. Is that still the case, or what's happening?
Actually,
there?
we addressed that. I think that there's a designer's note box out which literally says "put away the clippers."
Good.
Because the idea is one of the things that makes gangers different from the other members of your gang is that when you buy a ganger, you pick their equipment. They now have that. They can't get rid of it. The idea is that that's Zeke who has his shotgun. That's his shotgun. He's not get rid of that shotgun. That's his weapon.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So if you want to get a ganger with something different, you'll buy a new ganger into the gang.
Right, right.
Your more prominent characters, leaders, champions, whatever else, they can have different loadouts. And so what you'll do is you might have 2 different fighter cards for your leader with 2 different miniatures, and when you come to play, you'll pick which one you use. So we wanted to make it an additive thing rather than a thing where you have to destroy a model you've spent time painting, because in my experience, 1 in 50 people will do it. Everyone else will just go, oh, by the way, he's actually got a plasma gun now.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And hey, if I want to just buy a new model that looks like this other loadout, I can do that. That seems sensible to me. Yeah.
Well, and even
with
just
the
having the
plastic kits
cards.
now- Yeah, precisely. Yeah, you have that there. That's nice and straightforward. You know exactly what it is.
I have to say, there's one question. Sort of like you've talked about the Goliath and the Eschers, and that's wonderful. I'm pleased to see those models. But
Yep.
what I suppose the general question I should be asking is, do you have plans for other gangs and so on? But I don't really care. I want to know, when's Delac coming? So are they coming? Delac was the gang I rolled with, but I guess in general, do you have other plans for the other original gangs? Maybe even some new ones.
Yeah, I mean, I don't anymore, unfortunately, but I do know that there are plans to release all 4 of the remaining 6 main house gangs in 2018. I'm not sure of any details beyond that. Before I left, they were working on all of them. There were some really interesting discussions on what they are, and again, it's looking at how to diversify them slightly. So in the way that we've really ramped up the big meathead aspect of Goliath, we looked, for example, with Delac, how do you make them the ultimate spy masters and sneaky gits?
Right.
So there's lots of talk of them using...
Give them longer trench coats.
The length of your trench coat is a mark of your rank within the gang. But yeah, having using illegal drugs like spook to manifest psychic powers to make them telepathic, all this kind of thing.
Oh, that sounds awesome.
And when I was working on the initial ideas for their armory, it was lots of non-lethal weapons, so like webbers and needle rifles, things that can take someone down and capture them. Because I mean, the campaign system has full rules for capturing enemy fighters, and to me, that's one of the things that Delac should do really well. They should be able to capture you, squeeze you for information, and then sell you on.
I love that. Sounds awesome.
But yeah, all the other gangs, everything that's existed for Necromunda is looking at getting a redo, and there are lots of new ideas as well that I know are filtering through. So it's a good time.
Well, you definitely couldn't have picked Delac with this set if you're going for the big hair, because they're all bald. So it would not have...
Yeah, absolutely.
Although I could argue that would make for a nice contrast if we were going for contrast, but I will patiently await. I will patiently wait.
Excellent. Well, so will I, because as I say, I'm now on the outside looking in, so I'm looking forward to seeing what happens to all that stuff.
So just to tangent a little bit, as somebody that does enjoy Shadow War Armageddon, there was I don't know if it is founded, but there was somebody was quoted that works at Games Workshop that there was going to be support for Shadow War moving forward, and I'm always curious about because there's a supplement actually that you can use gangers in Shadow War, and it's always kind of interesting. Like, okay, these are Space Marines or Chaos Marines. And they're going to be fighting, Eschers. That's not really a fair fight.
Yeah, no.
And I was curious if you knew of anything that was going to be some kind of crossover, because they're in the same universe, but they're in obviously different sort of tiers.
I know. I mean, as far as I'm aware, there aren't plans to directly cross over the two, because as you say, it's kind of a matter of scaling, really. So, for example, in Necromunda, a couple of the weapons are a bit more beefed up than they are in 40k, because you're zoomed in. So bolt guns are a bit more like what you'd expect a bolt gun to be if you read the backstory. So shooting someone with a bolt gun, they're not going to shrug that off. They're going to have a really, really bad day. And I think it's one of those things where there's an abstraction where just because a Space Marine and a Ganger might have the same strength value, that's compared to the arena that they're fighting in. So I think if you were to port a Space Marine into Necromunda, you'd have to beef them up to such a degree that it would kind of be entirely unfair. So as far as I'm aware, I think things are being kept separate. I know there were mumblings of maybe introducing some of the things like chaos cults, gene stealer cults, the kind of the your more civilian type side of 40k could make its way into Necromunda at some point. But I'm not entirely sure. We'll see.
Well, Rodney, do you have any other Necromunda related questions? I wanted to transition into some more James Hewitt related questions.
No, I feel like I've gotten a nice little feast of information there. I'm really excited. So no, that's great. If you got some other tangential questions, I'm curious to hear them.
Well, James, you mentioned a bit ago that you were working on this, and this was, I believe you said this was the third thing that you worked on.
Yes.
While at GW. And are there other things coming out that will have the James Hewitt touch to it?
Yeah. So our team started in, I think it was March last year, and it wasn't until November that Blood Bowl was released. So Blood Bowl came out, but before it came out, we had several months during which I finished off Blood Bowl itself. It had already been started before I got there, and then I spent a lovely, I think it was about eight months of the year working on a revamp of Adeptus Titanicus, which was a classic game from the 80s. Big, massive Titanic robots just absolutely slugging each other with big guns and things. And it was a real labour of love. What was nice was because I was working on it before Blood Bowl came out, we were under the radar. No one was looking at us. As soon as Blood Bowl came out and was very successful, all eyes swiveled towards us. But before then, I was able to kind of spend a lot of time doing lots of R&D, lots of testing, really kind of making this game as cool as it could be. Ironically, it then got pushed back, and pushed back and pushed back for various different reasons. When you've got a company the size of Games Workshop, trying to find a release window for a new game launch is no mean feat. And also there was a decision halfway through. And initially it was going to be a very small-scale specialist game. All the Titans were going to be in Forge World resin, which is all it's all hand cast. You know, it's quite labour-intensive to produce it. At some point, some of the forecasting team, I think, said, "Hang on, this is going to do really, really well. If we want to supply X many copies of the game, we'll need to make this many Titans. We should have started a year ago." And so the decision was made instead to do it in plastic rather than resin, which is a winner for everyone involved. Not for Chris, who was our sculptor on the team, who, having just finished scaling down the Warhammer 40,000 Titans into that scale, had to redo it all over again because sculpting plastic models is a very different experience. I think he's been there about a year and a half now, and all he's worked on is Titans, and one day he'll be allowed to do something else. Sorry, he did the Death Roller for Blood Bowl. Whenever there was like a show and we'd be sat behind a desk with things we'd worked on, Chris would just be going, "Yeah, still Titans, still just Titans." And I can't show you them yet. I can show you nothing. But yeah, long story short, that game is coming out eventually at some point. I think hopefully early next year. We'll see though. Weirdly, we've already shown it off. We did a demo of the game back at the Horus Heresy Weekend. It was an event back in February, and I ran a couple of large scale, so 40k scale games. I literally spent about a week making some big foam card buildings and scaled up tape measures and huge accoutrements and ran the game, and everyone really enjoyed it. So
Is it
just Titans? Or
yes.
Is there... Okay.
So early on there was a lot of discussion about do we remake Epic as it was,
right,
which was, you know, your big scale battles, lots of troops, or do we focus just on Titans? And the answer was focus on Titans, because if you want to do Epic properly, you've kind of got to do one of everything in Warhammer 40,000 at that scale. And even though a lot of it's sculpted digitally these days, even kind of debigifying a thing takes, you know, even at least a month, because you have to do so much re-engineering to make it work at that scale. Right. And it would just be such a suck on resources. We were like, well, let's just focus on a game that's about really cool big robot battles and go from there. So that game, you know, you're really in the position of you are commanding that Titan. You are channeling power to different weapon systems. You're tracking individual locational damage. Right. It's good fun.
How big are these Titans, like as a model? How tall is this?
They are kind of so to give you a an idea of scale, the Warlord Titan, which is like the big one, the main class of Titan, is probably about 8 inches tall, I would say, roughly.
Okay.
So they're bigger than they used to be back in the day, but they look really cool.
Wow. So, how many Titans does each team get? Can you start with probably a handful in the box, and can you scale it up to have like 20 on a side? Maybe that's way too many, but
yeah, the default kind of game that where it plays really really smoothly and nicely is between 3 and 5 Titans with maybe a handful of knights skirmishing. That's you can absolutely play bigger, but it just starts to slow down. But I mean, what I'm really proud of is I played a few games like 1-on-1, so literally 2 Titans on the table, 1 each side, and there were still interesting decisions to be made. There were still interesting strategies to think about, even at that point where you have 1 Titan each. And that was very intentional, because if they were going to be an all resin release, it could be that one of those Titans was going to be £60 or £70, or I don't know how many dollars that is, but you'd have to make it an interesting game with just 1 model aside, and I think we achieved that. So yeah.
I guess one other question about that. I haven't played the original. Is it a more close port, like as akin to Blood Bowl, or is it more of a deviation like Necromunda?
It's more of a Necromunda situation. What we did was we looked at all the different games we've done that involve Titans in the past. So Adeptus Titanicus had kind of 2.5 versions as that game, plus about 3 different editions of Epic in different guises. So there was lots to draw on. And also I looked back at things like Heavy Gear, Battletech, Mech Warrior, anything that involved big robots fighting, and just kind of drew on all different inspirations. I kind of went pretty deep on the R&D with this one. And so it feels like an amalgam, but it hopefully draws kind of cool bits. If people have played the originals, they will recognize certain elements from different parts.
Okay,
that's something
cool.
to
well,
look
I'm
forward
excited
to.
for that.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, when it comes out, give me a shout and I'll come back on and we can talk more about it.
Okay, yeah, great. We'll make this an annual thing. What else you got in the GW pipeline? Anything?
That's pretty much it, actually. That'll be the last thing that I did when I was working there, or rather the earlier thing, but that'll be me exhausted by that point. Although I have, since I've been a freelancer, I've done another self-contained board game for Games Workshop, but that's all very hush-hush, and I can't tell you any more than I've already said.
Oh, man.
Silver Tower 2. No, I don't know.
When it comes out, I'll wave my arms around online and you'll know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you doing other designs outside GW right now, or?
Yeah. So when I first started up Needy Cat Games, which is my little company, I was mainly doing a few bits and pieces for Games Workshop, mainly tying up loose ends from where I'd left. But now I'm pretty much exclusively working for other people. So one of the reasons I was at Essen last week, I went to have lots of meetings and catch up with people. So I've got lots of little freelance projects on the go. I'm doing a game for a company called Room 17 Games, who have just put a Kickstarter out. And we've got a few projects on the go there. One of which actually is, again, I'm sworn to secrecy, but it's basically another revamp of an old game. So that's quite cool to get to do that
in your
again.
Wheelhouse, it seems like. Yeah.
I'm absolutely pigeonholing myself, but I'm okay with that. Eventually, I've got 3 or 4 designs of my own that I really want to kind of work on, but I haven't found the time. I've been too busy, which is a good problem to have.
Well, you were at Essen. Was there anything that you picked up there just for your own enjoyment? I know you're running short on time probably for playing games, but what sort of games do you like to break out and play yourself?
So I picked up. I was pretty good at Essen. Last time I went, I came back with I think 14 games. I came back with 3 this time. No, 2 in fact, 2 games.
Okay.
3. It was 3. So I picked up Junkart, which I've had my eye on for a while, which is
it's super fun.
I like. Yeah, absolutely. I like dexterity games, and I don't know the story behind it, but I've got a suspicion. So I've got a toddler. She's 2 years old, and she has lots of building blocks and things. And the number of times I've sat with a pile of building blocks and thought, there's got to be a game in stacking these up. And I can't help wondering if the Junkart, if that's where that came from. But yeah, picked that up. Picked up Magic Maze as well, which I haven't had a chance to play yet, but I'm I run a little local gaming club, and I'm taking it along on Monday, so I'm looking forward to trying that.
I wish I could play that game. I have it. I play it with people.
Yeah.
I can play one scenario, maybe two if I'm lucky, and then no one wants to continue playing. It's a
Really?
very high stress game, and I don't mind that.
Yeah.
But other people, it drives them bonkers.
Yeah.
So
I think it's one of those, you've got to find the right people, I suppose.
yeah, yeah.
Well, Rodney, when you start throwing things at people,
Hey, hey. It was just aggressively pushed in your direction. It wasn't thrown.
And the other thing I picked up the 3 new Exit the Game, the escape room little mini game. I've played one of them so far, and it really blew me away. I wasn't expecting much. I picked it up because it was a bit of research for something else I was working on, and it made me smile because it had some really clever little ideas in it. And so I picked up 3 more of those. We'll see how they go. But yeah, no, I mean, I play a lot of different stuff. Probably one of my enduring favourites is Stronghold,
wow.
which is...
From Portal Games.
That's the one, yes indeed, yeah. Haven't played 2nd edition, but I love 1st edition. It was one of the... I picked it up last time I was at Essen, actually, a few years ago, and I just really like it. I like the fact that it's got this kind of... It's very thematic, while still not feeling too swingy. A lot of what goes on is very much down to your own decisions, and I love the idea that when you're the attacker, everything you do gives the defender something to do back against you. I like that a lot.
It seems crazy to me that as the king of 2nd edition design, that you have not picked up the 2nd edition of Stronghold.
I know, right? I know. What's that about?
What is that?
I absolutely should. And again, I've just picked up a copy of Twilight Imperium 3rd edition.
Okay. Well, there we go.
3rd edition.
Yeah, 3rd edition. Yeah, because
wait, you're still an edition behind.
Exactly. Yeah, but my reason for it was actually I've wanted Twilight Imperium for a long time. It's been kind of like the great white whale in my gaming collection. It's like one day I will have this, but I've never found it at a price that I wanted to pay for a game I knew I would very rarely get to actually bring to the table. But then recently, of course, because 4th edition has come out, lots of them have turned up quite cheap on the second-hand market. I was like, I'm going to get this, and it'll live on my shelf, and one day, in about 10 years' time, I'll play it. And that'll be it. I'm happy.
Well, I think that's all the questions we have. Rodney, unless you have some more questions.
No, I think that's great. I feel like I've got a good dose of Necromunda. I've learned a little bit about James. I'm excited about new stuff coming out and new projects he's got coming out. All sounds great.
Well, thank you, guys. Thank you so much for having me on board. It's been a really, really fun time. I've enjoyed myself.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you staying up late. It's quite reasonable hour for me. It is quite unreasonable for you at this time. It must be midnight?
It is 20 past midnight, yeah. So,
20 past.
And I think I was awake at 5:30 this morning, so if you play this back and I'm not actually using words, I'm just honking and gibbering, then I wouldn't be surprised.
That would explain it. This is a treat for me, because normally when I do stuff with these guys, I'm the one who's way ahead of time, but you're way past me, so.
There you go. That would be it.
Well, James, yeah, I really appreciate you coming on, and you as well, Rodney, of course.
Oh, it was a treat for me. I feel like it was a gift. Thank you, Joel.
Yeah, and I'm the same. James, I've been a fan of Silver Tower, a huge fan of that. I blame you for literally probably every single miniature I have upstairs painted, because that game got me into just. I love the game, and then I was like, I can't play with these gray, ugly things anymore.
That's how I found you, because I was trawling the Board Game Geek forums as I tend to do, and I saw you post one of your reviews. I was like, I'm going to watch what this guy's up to, and I've watched your collection grow.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is just a big circle of blame then, because the reason I'm doing all this is because of Joel. Joel's like, okay, Necromunda I would have come to on my own, but after I assembled all the Necromunda figures and I'm sitting down getting ready to learn the rules, the little Age of Sigmar box started calling out to me because Joel's constantly in my ear about that game. I was like, well, maybe I'll just stop and I'll put together one of those miniatures. And sure enough, I did, and that's just going to lead to more of them. So it's
a slippery slope, man.
It's very slippery, very slippery.
It is.
Brilliant stuff.
Okay, gentlemen, once again, thank you. Everybody, hope you enjoyed the interview and got a lot of good information about Necromunda, as well as some other tidbits of other things. Definitely look for the next podcast coming up later. And thank you once again for James and Rodney to join me.
A pleasure.
Thank you. Anytime.
Okay, I hope everyone enjoyed that interview as much as we did. We had a great time putting that together, and I hope there was a lot of good information for you there about Necromunda, as well as some other little tidbits that James shared with us about some of the upcoming games and a little bit of the insight into kind of the development process there at Games Workshop, who, as it stands, is kind of a very unique company in terms of their production schedule and the amount of collaboration and the overall sort of group and large team effort. Compared to most publishers in the board game industry, who, by comparison, run a much leaner, meaner operation and have a different kind of production schedule and all that kind of stuff. So I found that very interesting personally. So let's jump into some reviews, and I'm going to go ahead and review 2 games, and these are not games that I'm going to do videos for. The first one is definitely one that I would throw on what I call the blacklist. It's not something I would recommend. The second one, I have a hard time recommending it, but we'll leave that one for a second. We'll jump into the first one, and that's going to be Alien Artifacts. This is from Portal Games. And I'm very sort of disappointed to mention that to you, because this was one of my top 10 anticipated games at Essen, and it was sort of right in my wheelhouse. It was a Portal game, and I like 80% of the games that they put out, roughly. I like their sensibilities and all that kind of cool stuff, and it was right in that 51st State / Imperial Settlers type of game, where it's a lot of card management and you're building up a tableau and all that kind of cool stuff. And it had a real kind of 4X sci-fi style of theme. And so I was really excited about this one, thinking it would hit me right between the eyes, but it did not. I played this one twice, and to just about a person, and I think everybody did not like it. We didn't have all the same players in both games when we played, and the sort of cutting the story short, the game was just very vanilla. What the idea of the game is you have these different sort of powers. You have like science powers and war powers and things like that. And you have different cards that represent them. And when you sort of buy the cards, you can keep them face up for kind of a long-term benefit once you deploy them, or you can flip them on their side and flip them face down. And that's more of an immediate kind of action that you're going to take. And the resources that you get are these little hand of cards that have these different kind of configurations of resources on them. So you're getting these cards, drawing those every turn, and then you're kind of trying to make use of them to activate these different powers and sort of construct these different cards into your tableau to have different special abilities. And meanwhile, you're managing like a little track of money that you can use to get those cards kind of in the queue, and then you use your resources to build and develop them. And there is a little bit of kind of player versus player attacking in there, but it's real, it's real Euro. It's real sort of just not exciting. And so that's the whole kind of crux of the game, is it's just not very exciting. And it has one kind of flaw that just pushed it over the edge. And to me, I said flaw. For me, it's a flaw. I don't know that it's a design flaw. But you have this thing where when you hurt somebody, you can, instead of like destroying a card, you can put a little token on the card, and they have to basically pay $1 to activate it, which is fine. That's kind of a nice, somewhat friendly way to not completely destroy somebody's card, but you can just kind of attack them, and then based on the ability of this like little mini chart, I don't want to call it a chart, but it's like a little list of effects that can happen based on how effectively you attack them. You can do different things and maybe destroy some ships and things like that. And but the main effect is you put a little token on one of their little constructions that they've built, and they can't activate it unless they pay $1. And then you can also use your resources to get rid of them permanently. But the thing that irritated me the most about this is if you went after a strategy of activating these trade powers, you can activate them during the game, and it's somewhat random that they're going to work. But then at the end of the game, you can go through and activate all of them. But if you have no money and you have these little negative tokens stacked on there, it's very easy to gimp somebody that has gone that strategy. Now, they could keep money around to sort of spend at the end of the game and activate. But if you're playing a 4-player game and everybody jumps on you, then it becomes pretty unwieldy to be able to, stay ahead of the curve. In a 2-player game, it's not going to be that big of a deal. And that's not necessarily like, I don't think it's a bad design implementation. It's just something you have to consider. I just don't like how it comes across, especially at the end of the game, where it's like, okay, I've built all this stuff up and I'm going to score these endgame points. And then you just kind of tacked all these negative debuff penalties on me, just to kind of ruin my end game. And I just didn't like how that felt, because it just, like, okay, I'm at the end of the game and I have to spend all this money, and I'm just going to kind of like passive aggressively just, your end game is going to suck. And then, I'm going to do my thing and you're going to do your thing. And now I've just kind of ruined your engine that you've spent the whole game building. I just didn't like how that felt at all. So that kind of combined with sort of the real vanilla kind of powers, because the powers are just like, oh, make this cheaper, do this. When you add cards to your display, everything goes up in price, but then you have powers that can ignore that. There was no really flashy powers that, you can see, oh, I built this up and I did this really cool thing. It was just, oh, this is cheaper. Okay, now this is, I can do this with one less ship, or I can do this with that. So you're just kind of, is a sort of purely engine building. There wasn't enough kind of trashiness in it to make it feel like it was a spacey, sci-fi kind of attitude. And so, I mean, out of the 3, you could say this is kind of the third in the trilogy, even though it's a different designer, of Imperial Settlers 51st State. This is one I would there's no reason to get this over 51st State or Imperial Settlers or many other games. So I was pretty disappointed in that one. So that's Alien Artifacts from Portal. So anyway, that's that one. And then the next game is a little bit tricky, because this is a game that I do enjoy, I do have fun with. I can see why people don't like it. And I think the majority of people I've played it with don't like it. They kind of end up even if they do like it, it's kind of like where I'm at, where they kind of like it and they can see that it's fun, but it kind of starts to wear on you. So that's kind of the takeaway. But Tulip Bubble is a very interesting game, and I do recommend folks probably give it a try. At least, maybe it's one of those try before you buy kind of ideas. And it's about the Tulip Bubble crisis, Tulip Mania, that happened, I think, in the 1600s in the Netherlands. And so you have this sort of overinflated different tulip prices. And you have like a market of tulips that come in, and there are different kinds of tulips and different rarities and things. And you have this kind of interesting little bidding round where you put these little tokens on it, kind of declaring that you're going to bid for something. So you can see, okay, who's going for what. And you can get a sense based on the tokens of what's put out, what tulips are going to be removed from the supply, because that's going to affect the price of the tulips after everybody's done buying them up. So then that can kind of inform your future places that you put the tokens on. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And then once the tokens are on there, if you have your own token on there, you get the card. If there's multiple tokens from multiple players, then you all have kind of a bidding. And then you get the tulips in your hand. You're trying to basically build sets of them. And there's different notations on there, like there's letters and numbers on the different tulips. And so there's a weird little chart it's a very ingenious little chart to kind of show like the different varieties of tulips and then kind of the specialties within those varieties. And there's a cool track about how those prices are going to move up and down based on the tulips that are sort of left on the board, because you're kind of pulling those tulips out of the supply, out of the general market. And the most rare ones are then going to jump up, and the ones that everybody's left there are going to fall down. And then you have these event cards that are going to come up every round, and they're going to randomly move tulips up in price or down in price, or kind of tank the market. Or there's one card in there that everything will kind of jump up. Not everything, but the lowest one will jump up and all that kind of stuff. So there's a different kind of random element to it, and that it's very tight economy. So if something drops, it's going to kind of leapfrog the other prices and jump down. It's not just going to move down one spot. It's going to jump over anything that's kind of in its way. So it can drop very drastically. But you know this going in. So I don't think, again, this is not like a design problem. It's just going to fit people's palate and their taste. And there's a bunch of cards in there. I think there's 3 at most that can be in there that are really going to, tank the market in general. So you're going to have something you think you're going to be able to cash in after you've bought, and then it's just going to get tanked, and there's nothing you can do about it. So it's a very, very volatile game, and it's hilarious in a lot of ways because it will just like ruin you, and then you kind of get back on your feet, and then it'll ruin some other player and stuff. But it's very, very random how it works. But again, you kind of know that, so you can kind of play around that and kind of play the long game because given a certain color tulip, you can kind of bet, okay, it's low on the market now. If everybody goes after it, then it's going to be rare. It's going to jump up, but then it might be susceptible to kind of a big plummet in the price. So you can kind of play around that. And now the other thing that has an interesting about it is not only can you sell back to the market, but you can sell to these collectors, and that's kind of where the set collecting comes in. There's different collectors you can go for that you can sell based on the market price, but there's a little bit of a bonus if you get a certain collection of them. So that's very interesting. But the way that works out can also be random because if I've got a set that's ready and then Billy there across the table buys it before me because of turn order, and this is huge, then that collector goes away and then a new one may come up, but then I might have the right set for any of the available collectors that are there. So you're just kind of sitting there on it. And then, okay, you're like, okay, well, I'll wait. And then the market tanks and they're completely worthless. So it's a very quick filler game. It takes like 30, 45 minutes. It is fun. You're kind of on the seat of your pants and you just know like danger is around the corner. And that's a really fun part of it. And I like that. But there's definitely been plenty of people that I've played it with that did not like it at all because of that. Because I think it feels like it kind of removes the choice from, what you've got going on. But this is one I would recommend people try and check out and play. And it doesn't take that long. And so it can be kind of a filler. And if you're kind of into maybe a little bit more heavier economic kind of style of games, this could be one that you could kind of fall back into. Because I think there is some depth here to just explore, but there's a lot of heartbreak kind of built in. So this is kind of one of those. Usually my cutoff for like a blacklist is as I would rate it on BGG of 5 or lower. 6 and up, usually something I'll give a review. But this is one I'd give a 6. But there's just been enough people that I played it with that this would be like they don't want to ever play it again. Very, very few that said, yeah, I would probably play it once or twice more. I had a good time, but they don't really feel like it's a good game, so to speak. So that's why I'm kind of squeezing that one in here. So that's really all the new things that I've been playing. I've been getting back into Age of Sigmar a little bit more recently, and also playing Shadespire for that matter. But that's not a new game, so I'm not going to review those again. But yeah, I've still been enjoying those, and I kind of took a little bit of a break from miniatures there for a bit, and was just kind of getting back into board games. But now I've been playing some Age of Sigmar and messing around with the Firestorm campaign, which looks like a lot of fun. I'll probably do a review of that relatively soon. But if you think of it, it's kind of like Warhammer Legacy. It's got like a map and stickers, but the stickers are reusable. And I've just kind of been fiddling around, reading through that, and then just kind of playing a couple battles, just separate from that, but just kind of keeping that in mind. So I plan to do something with that in the future. So if you are listening and you are into Age of Sigmar and you have some friends to play it with, I would definitely recommend Firestorm. It looks like just a boatload of fun. Lots of cool, thematic, narrative, flavorful kinds of things that you can add. And there's a map that you can kind of take over and get special artifacts and different special abilities and all that kind of cool stuff. And it's, like I said, it's kind of a legacy / campaign idea. And you can replay it too. So once you play the campaign to its conclusion, you can just kind of peel the stickers off the board, and then there's a couple of little modifications you can make. The winner gets a bonus going to the next time. But you can play the campaign over and over and over again and leave some of these little artifacts on the map. And the stickers are really cool. They're like these color form stickers. I don't know. I think you had to probably be alive in the 80s to do that. But there's those stickers that you can reuse like 100 times, and they won't lose any of their stick. They're not really sticky, but they just kind of sort of, I don't know, through friction or something, they kind of just stick onto the board. It's really cool. So anyway, that's kind of what I've been playing lately. And I'll throw in a little bit of the random pop culture thing. I am almost done with Stranger Things Season 2. We've got one more to watch. We're going to watch that here in the next day or so. Really enjoyed this season. It probably started off maybe a little bit awkward, but I'm just kind of nitpicking compared to season one, because season one I like that from maybe the first 10 minutes all the way through the entire season. This one, there's a kind of a couple episodes of sort of catch up and kind of retelling some things that have sort of, been missed in the year, between the two seasons. But once it gets going, like this, kind of the level of sort of emotional impact and everything is really heightened, I think, even over season one. So I'm really chomping at the bit to watch the last episode. So we just got to find some time to set aside, because, like I said, everything's been real busy. And the other little thing, I watched, Blade Runner 2049 twice now, and that's amazing. And again, this is, I think, maybe better than the original. It's kind of slow and plodding. So if you're really into, lots of action and you want to go into it thinking of that, just before one, it's a very kind of slow, there's a lot of kind of quiet spaces and things, but I really like what they kind of did with this and how they moved it forward. And it kind of backfilled for me some of the weird parts of the original. There's a couple of scenes in the original that kind of watching now are like, they're just really awkward. I mean, I guess the movie's like, how many years old now? When did it come out? Like in 80? I can't remember when it came out, but so it came out a long time ago. I never saw it in the theater, obviously, but there's a weird scene where he goes into somebody's dressing room in the original. It just doesn't make any sense, but kind of looking at sort of some of the questions they answer, and there's some awkward moments like that in terms of Harrison Ford's character in the original. And I'm like, this is not normal for a person to behave this way. So yeah, they kind of answers that a little bit, in a sense. And there's some other strange interactions that were cool, because there was kind of like, sort of not plot holes, but there were holes that were kind of left there to fill you in. Like, is this person who I think they are? Are they doing this because of this? And they kind of sort of answer some of those questions without getting too crazy with it, in my opinion. They don't like go back and kind of ruin or rewrite the original. They kind of just fill in some of the gaps and they kind of move the story forward. And then it just kind of, sort of, it does it in such a way that they're not always explaining things to you, all the time. Like, oh, well, this happened, and there's a big flashback sequence of 15 minutes, and then they explain everything. You're just like, oh, okay, this is probably how this relates. So I like when stories do that. Anyway, so I definitely recommend that one. And the soundtrack in the original is amazing, but the soundtrack in this one I think is even better. Really stark and just really powerful in a lot of ways. I'm not equipped to review movies at all, and this one, it just kind of left me speechless. I talked about Dunkirk a couple of months ago, and that was probably my movie of the year. I would put Dunkirk and Blade Runner 2049 up there, but I keep hearing that the new Thor is really good, and everybody's saying that's their movie of the year. But that's kind of my top two. If I had to drive through Oscars, Dunkirk and Blade Runner 2049 would be in a dead heat. So we'll see, though, by the end of the year. Okay, well, that is it for this episode of the podcast. Again, really hope you enjoyed the interview, and definitely take care of yourselves, and I will speak at you later. Thanks. Bye.